Welcome to Build a Better Career, the show that helps you build a better career so you can create a better life. I'm your host, Diane Bogino. I'm delighted to welcome Dave Cohen to the show today. Dave enters his 40th year at Georgia State University, his journey beginning as a student in 1982 through employment today in Alumni Affairs and GSU Athletics. In the Alumni office, Dave coordinates the website as well as various alumni programs, including the virtual resume reviews and career-oriented webinars. On the athletic side, Dave has been the radio voice of the Panthers for now 40 seasons, covering Panther basketball, football, and baseball. Dave was awarded Georgia State's prestigious Sparks Award in 2016 and was inducted into the Georgia Radio Hall of Fame, GHROF, in 2017. Now here's Dave to talk about his exciting career at Georgia State and his plans for the future. Dave, welcome to the show. It's great to see you.
Great to see you, Diane. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
Yeah, it's been a long time. You know, Dave, I want to start out by maybe a controversial question. Most people think that alumni offices just exist to make money for a university, but tell us how the Georgia State Alumni Office is different.
Well, yeah, you're right about that. Historically, alumni offices have been heavily involved from the fundraising standpoint. And certainly Georgia State's alumni office, which you're familiar with, having been on our board of directors in the past, we do fall under the umbrella of development at Georgia State. And while we know that's an important factor, with what we're involved with, in the 22 going on 23 years that I've been in the alumni office at Georgia State, and I've been at the university overall for 40, we're a very event-oriented alumni office. We plan events, we host events, not just in Atlanta, but in some of the major cities around the country in order to maintain connection with Georgia State alumni in Atlanta, in the state of Georgia, and like I said, in some of the other large markets. So again, while it always ultimately comes back to a development standpoint, our job is to maintain connection with Georgia State alumni, keep them involved with the university, keep them connected to the university, and make them feel like they are, as they should be, an ongoing part of the Panther family.
Yeah, I think you do a great job of that. But how have services changed over the years, do you think?
For us, it's always kind of been twofold. Career service is always a very important aspect to what we do, what we offer. The way that's changed a little bit is, when I got to the alumni office in May of 2000, we had a 2-person career services staff just within the alumni office. And then it became a 1-person staff, and then it became a 0-person staff as it is now. I facilitate some of our career services programs, but I'm not a career services professional. And part of the reason why it's maybe gone in that direction is you already had university career services on campus, but then each of the individual colleges have brought about their own career services. A good example is, the Robinson College of Business with their Delta Career Center, which is fantastic. Obviously, a school within the university like the College of Law, because of its specialty, has its own career services office and person. Andrew Young School of Policy Studies has its own career services person and office. So again, the need for us to have necessarily our own career services person may not be what it was back in the early 2000s with the way the individual colleges have developed on their own.
But how does the alumni office work in partnership with the various services that other, offices on the campus provide?
Again, it comes down to relationships and knowing who the individual career services people are in those individual offices. The alumni office has always been more than willing to partner and help promote their events and they vice versa usually help us promote our events. So whenever possible, there's a lot of partnership between the two, because at the end, the ultimate goal is to offer the services and provide the value of those services to our alumni. Whether they're a current student, whether they're a senior who's getting ready to graduate, whether they're a Robinson College alum, a College of Law alum, an Andrew Young School alum, a College of Education alum, and so on and so forth. Really, at the end of the day, it's a customer service, opportunity for us to provide back to our, current students and to our alumni. So that's the way I've always viewed it. And I always try to, ascertain whether or not, after certain events, whether it's a resume review, whether it's some sort of career program, just to try to find out from the attendees, did you find it to be of value? And did you find it to be of assistance to you in whatever and wherever your job search currently finds you?
Yeah, that's a great way to do it. Tell the audience about the signature program that the Alumni Association offers during the year.
Well, there's two of them actually. We have our annual 40 under 40, which recognizes 40 under age 40 Georgia State alumni who are doing, really, again, valuable, outstanding things in the community. Most of the time it is Atlanta, but it doesn't have to be Atlanta. But, making a contribution to the Atlanta community in whatever way they choose to make that contribution. So, leading into the fall, right up through late September, we accept applications on an annual basis, and nominations, I should say. And then there's a committee that goes through all of those applications and those nomination forms and selects the 40 under 40. And then later on, there's a big event per se, that honors the 40 under 40. And it's been a great program, been going on for a number of years now, since Christina Millian got to the Alumni Association and helped start this program. And our other signature program, which I'm assuming you've been to in the past, is the annual Distinguished Alumni Awards dinner. And that is held during homecoming week each and every year, so late October. And they the university selects, I should say, usually between 4 and 5 outstanding distinguished alumni, again, who have done outstanding, fantastic, recognizable things in their community, whether it's Atlanta or somewhere outside of Atlanta. And so, we're getting ready to host both of those events coming up in the next few months. And, Distinguished Alumni Awards will be later on in the month of October as part of homecoming week.
Those are two great programs. So let's talk about your career for a few minutes. You attended Georgia State, as I did. What year did you graduate?
I graduated with my bachelor's in '94.
Okay, and I'm class of 07, but I'm a lot older than you are. But
maybe not.
But as we said, you've been at Georgia State for 40 years, starting as a student. Tell us a little bit about how you started your career and a little bit about your career path.
I ended up attending 3 different high schools because of my parents moving. So 1 year in Massachusetts, 1 year in New Hampshire, and then finally here in the Atlanta area. And so I graduated, from Walton High School out in Marietta. And there was no spring break. My mother at the time brought me down to Georgia State. And next thing you know, I'm enrolled at Georgia State. There was no spring break trip, nothing like that. And I had an interest growing up in Boston, being a big sports fan, but I also am one of those folks that really enjoyed the radio. So it was kind of like, wow, how can I combine 2 things that I really, really love and see if I can make a career out of it? And the reason why I kind of went down that path was because I have a cousin who is in my hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts, who still owns a radio station there. And I can remember listening to him as a kid and he's obviously a little older than I am, but thinking, wow, that's really cool. He's talking on the radio and I know him. Now, he was not a sports oriented guy on the radio. It was more music oriented, but I still thought it was really cool to be able to listen to somebody who I actually knew on the radio. So that first day that my mother brought me down to Georgia State, I was already familiar with Georgia State's radio station, WRAS. And so after going through advisement and selecting classes, I said, hey, let's go by the radio station and check it out. So I did. And I'm still involved one way or another with that radio station 40 years later, because it still carries Georgia State football, basketball, and, in the past, baseball. But, I was able to find a way to combine my love of sports and my interest and now love of the radio business. So I worked in the radio business here in Atlanta for about 12 or 13 years, all the while still employed at Georgia State doing ball games. And it's one of those things where you never expect to be somewhere, for 40 years.
Right.
And then, I don't know, 15 years turns into 20 and 20 turns into 25. And at the time, even though I didn't know her, my wife still works at Georgia State, but she worked in athletics first as the tennis coach and then as the academic advisor. And she started the academic program for athletes at Georgia State. Now, again, I didn't know her, but somebody introduced us, and 26 years later, we're still here, and we're both still employed at Georgia State, and both of our kids went through daycare at Georgia State. And so Georgia State has been very good to us, and hopefully we've been very good to it as well. And it's hard to believe it's been 40 years. From a sports aspect, I've been involved with Georgia State basketball for 40 years and baseball for 40 years or thereabouts. But for football, we didn't start until 2010. So this is year 13. And for the prior 12 years, I was working on the radio crew up at Furman University in Greenville on their football broadcast because we didn't have it. So, and I had a connection up there, and like, well, if you want to work on a football broadcast, you're going to have to travel. So I did.
Yes, you have a great voice for radio, that's for sure. Dave, today changing jobs has become almost an art form. What is the benefit of staying with an organization as long as you have, as opposed to changing careers so much, or do you think the other one is a better idea?
Well, I've had this conversation, probably a few times. Is there a part of me that wishes that when I was younger and had the wherewithal to maybe branch out and try something new in another city at another radio station? Do I wish that I had maybe tried that? Yeah, sure. There's a part of me that wishes that I had done that, but probably one of the smartest things that I did with help from my wife was after my last radio job, I was with another company basically on the Georgia State campus called Voice Information Services. It was a Cox and Bell South company. Hard to believe those two were together on a project, but I ultimately made the decision, because my wife wasn't going to move, to try to get on full time at Georgia State, and that really was, in hindsight, that was the smartest thing that I did. And the second smartest thing that I did was to enroll in Teachers Retirement System, TRS. Even though I'm not a teacher, I'm not an educator per se, but to get into the retirement system and really have it working for me as I work for Georgia State, and it, will pay dividends in the long run. And like I said, listen, I've always said Georgia State, for example, on the radio, it's not just a job, because I'm a Georgia State alum. And helping Georgia State alumni is satisfying because I'm another Georgia State alumni. I don't look at it necessarily as just a job. I do have a bit of a passion for it, and I have an emotional connection to it. I say the same thing about being on the radio calling Georgia State games. Now, I have to admit, I don't get quite as upset when we lose, but I don't just basically, oh, well, we lost the game, on to the next game, because I don't root for anybody else. I just happen to be in the position where I'm on the radio calling games for my alma mater. So I want us to win, And when we don't, yeah, it stings a little bit, but that emotional connection and that passion is there. Whereas if I was calling games at another university that I did not graduate from, it would be, oh, great, we won, or ah, man, that's too bad, we lost. But we'll talk to you again next week, and just not have it affect you at all.
Yeah.
And so, I look at my position a little different, whether it's in the alumni office or whether it's on the radio in athletics, because I am an alum, and that passion and the enthusiasm is real, because this is where I graduated from. This is my university, and this is my teams that I pull for.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've got some skin in the game, so to speak.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the things that you do and the qualifications it takes. Now, I know you're not an event planner, but still coordinating these programs, what qualifications would a person have to do something like that?
Well, in May of 2000, when I left voice information services and full-time radio and started working in the alumni office, I had like zero qualifications for any of it. I basically learned on the run. It was the very early outset of the internet.
Mm.
And so I learned on the run, how to update the Georgia State Alumni website. And these 22 years later, that website has lived in 5 different programs that I've had to learn one at a time as we have morphed the website from one program to the next. But I, like a lot of people, in 2000, I didn't know how to update websites. I didn't know how websites were built or any of that. And I had no experience, for the most part, in event planning. But again, I guess I could say, just like the radio, when I started on the radio in 1982, 83, I had no experience. I had never been on the radio before, but I learned on the run. So I only say that because it almost is like a parallel from what I did on that side to the way I learned on the alumni side. And we had some good people in the alumni office when I first got there, who kind of were able to show me the ropes a little bit. And the one thing I learned about planning events is just attention to detail and really staying ahead of each of the details in planning an event so that nothing would fall through the cracks. And so again, I really kind of learned on the run, but to me, it's always, and I'm of the age where, yeah, I love having my iPhone, but at the end of the day, when I plan an event, I've got a piece of paper, and I physically write down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is what has to be done by X date. And as we do it, I cross it off. I'm a physical pen in hand, paper on the table, cross off as things are done and accomplished, because that's just how my brain works. I mean, it's great to do it on the phone if that's something that, someone's comfortable with. But I'm old school with regards to writing down what has to be done and crossing it off when it's been done. And in event planning, that really kind of, to me, is the most important thing, because there's so many details depending on what kind of an event it is, to make sure that everything is handled, every T is crossed, every I is dotted, and every tablecloth is put out, and every little centerpieces on every table. It's kind of, when we do these 40 under 40 and distinguished alumni award events, the entire alumni office, it's an all hands on deck event, as opposed to an event that I just do for a certain select group that we'll call a Dave event. And we all kind of do the same thing. There's just a master list of everything from name tags to tablecloths to flowers for the centerpiece to audio and visual, and then you're, dealing with a caterer, and then dealing with the sound people that handle audio and visual, and the lights, and you just name it. There's a million things that have to be handled.
Right. So definitely detail oriented would be a skill.
No question. And it was a learned skill, because like I said, when I got to the alumni office in 2000, I had never really planned an event.
Yeah. But that's another good point, Dave, is that everybody has to be a continuous learner, because jobs change over the years, so OJT is always going to be there.
I mean, we've seen it in the alumni office, Diane. I mean, I can remember in the early days of being in the alumni office when we would be planning an event. And again, remember, this is very early days of the internet. So email wasn't really as common as we
Mm.
think of it today. We still designed, created flyers. Like, for example, if we were going to do our annual alumni night at the Atlanta Braves game, which is always a popular event, I would have our graphics designer design a flyer. I would take it over to paw prints on campus. We'd print 1,000 or 1,500 or however many. And then we'd all sit as a group in the office one day for a couple hours and we would stuff envelopes. And then we'd put stamps on the envelopes and then we'd take it over to the post office on campus. And that's how we sent out invitations for a Georgia State alumni event at the Atlanta Braves game.
Oh, wow.
We don't do that anymore.
No.
It's all done via broadcast email, posting events on the website. It's done by posting and promoting on social media channels,
Mm.
whether it's Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. I don't really do Instagram, but someone in our office does.
Mm.
So we're reaching alumni, but just in different ways. And, it's interesting because, for example, some of our alumni who are on the older side, they still want to receive things in the mail.
Mhm.
They're not as, I don't want to use the word comfortable because, I mean, I know people that are in their mid to upper 80s that are on Facebook and
Mhm.
LinkedIn, so on and so forth, but not everyone is.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful and make sure that we're reaching all of our alumni, not just young alumni who do everything on the iPhone or the iPad, but we're also reaching, our alumni. Like, for example, we do an event that is actually really popular. It's our senior alumni event, Senior Brunch and Learn. And it's always very well attended. We just did one recently at the World of Coca-Cola. So it usually involves going to a venue, like World of Coca-Cola, or we've also done like the Delta Museum out at Delta Airlines, out at the airport. They have a really cool museum out there, the
Mm.
history of Delta and history of flight, but then it involves, a luncheon. So, but we're always, mindful of how do we continue to maintain connection with, let's say, the 65 and older group.
That's great. That's great. Do you think that someone could create a career in radio today, whether it's music, news, or sports?
You can, but it's the culture and the current way the business is. It's hard to get in it and stay in it full time, and make a career of it. In my opinion, are there people doing it? Sure. But if you've got a family, you've got kids in school, young kids in school, a mortgage, car payments, it can be a risky business in that way because of the volatility of the whole media business. It's
Mm.
changing at a rapid pace.
Mhm.
So, I never tried to discourage a young person from getting into it. And you could even throw in newspapers as well, because that is a ever evolving business, as you know.
Mm.
There's a lot of people and a lot of good writers out there, but it's all switching to more of an online product as opposed to a product of newspapers and magazines that you and I grew up with, and at least me, I still enjoy. But it's tough to get in the TV and the radio business and stay in one place. Like, for example, in TV and radio in the old days, or the older days when I got started, nobody graduated from college and went right to a major market and started there.
Right.
Most of the time you had to go to, let's use Georgia for an example. You graduate from Georgia State and your first job is going to be in Macon. And you're going to go to Macon for a couple of years, and then you might move up to Augusta. And then from Augusta, you might go to Savannah. And from Savannah, you might go to Chattanooga. And then maybe you get a shot at coming into Atlanta or
Mm.
Greenville, South Carolina, or Charlotte. You have to be in a position at that point in your life to be able to move around like that. And if you've got
Right.
young kids in school, or you're married and your wife has a good job, she's not going to want to go from Macon to Augusta to Savannah to Chattanooga to Charlotte.
True.
So
That's
it's
true.
really, I always do say that if you're gonna take that path, it's for the young and the single.
Right.
Because
Yeah,
when you
do it.
only have to make sure that you have a roof over your head and that you can feed yourself, it's a lot easier to maneuver those
Mhm.
those moves as opposed to trying to move a family. It can be done. It's just the rapidly changing TV, radio, newspaper business has made it a lot harder.
Mm.
And I use myself as an example. Like I said, the younger Dave Cohen kind of wishes, looking back now, hey, maybe I should have taken a chance and tried to get a job at another radio station out of state. And I had a couple of opportunities that, I didn't chase hard enough. Um, but I guess in hindsight, it's always easy to look back in hindsight and think what could have been. But the way I look at it now is, I met my wife at Georgia State. I got 2 kids. Georgia State's been great to us.
Mm.
So
Yeah, Georgia State was great to me too because they gave me a degree. So Dave, there's probably something a lot of people don't know about you, and that is that you are an author. Tell our audience about your book.
published in July of 2010. It's called Matzoh Balls and Baseballs. It's a book featuring interviews with 17 Jewish former Major League Baseball players. And I'll give you the short story on how I decided to do this. Um, you remember Chapter 11 books?
Mhm.
There
Yes.
used to, yeah. So there used to be one in Alpharetta that I lived near at the time, and in the local Alpharetta paper, there was an ad one week that said there was a book signing with a guy that had just written a book called Cup of Coffee. Now, for your viewers, a cup of coffee in baseball terms means that you got called up and maybe you appeared in 1 game or 5 games or 10 games, but then you got sent back down and you never made it back to the major leagues again. Again, a happy, sad situation because they did ultimately reach the pinnacle of Major League Baseball and they got to experience it, but sad that they didn't stay. So anyway, I went to the book signing on a Saturday afternoon and I met the guy and I bought his book. And I still have the book. It's a really good book. I think he interviewed 20 something players, some of them who only appeared in 1 game as a major league player. They got sent back down to the minors.
Amazing.
One of the players that he interviewed that day was a guy by the name of Larry Yellen, Yellen. You wouldn't know him if you don't know baseball hardcore history. He was there at the book signing because what this guy would do is at every book signing, he would try to have one of the players that he interviewed at the signing. So Larry's at this signing. Well, it turns out Larry's a Jewish former Major League Baseball player. I had no idea who he was, but I met him and we got to talking. And a little while later, that light bulb went off in my head. And it's like, I really enjoy this book. I could take the template of what he's done with this book, which is right here, and I could narrow it down even more and just focus in on Jewish former major league players, because of the 10,000 plus players that have ever played in a major league game, the number of those that were Jewish major leaguers is like this.
Mm.
So it began the journey of working on that book. And of course, there were 2 players that lived right here in the Atlanta area, Larry being one of them. So I had his contact info. I went over to his house one night and interviewed him. And then I came back and over time typed it out and edited at the same time. Then I went to the other guy in Atlanta, Ron Bloomberg, played for the Yankees and the White Sox. Larry, by the way, played in Houston. And I interviewed Ron. And then I just started, I have a list. I just started, going through the list and trying to reach as many of those players as I could, one after the other. And when it took me 7 years of sitting at my counter at night typing, because I'd work on it and then I'd put it aside for a couple months and not touch it. And then I'd go back to it. And when I got to 17, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and publish this thing. I've been working on it for upwards of 7 years. So I published it, and I started out, I was going to self-publish. And then a friend of my wife's, who is a professor at the University of Southern California, got wind of what I was doing and reached out to me and said, he worked part-time for a small boutique publisher in West Hollywood, California, and they would be interested in talking to me about it. I said, great, this is even better. So I ended up publishing with them, and it was really kind of cool when they sent me that. When it first came out, they sent me, I'm not going to say it was the first book, but I got a package in the mail, and it was my first copy of that book, which was really cool because it was, I looked at it and was like, man, that's 7 years of sitting at the counter and sitting at the table in the kitchen at on vacation at the beach, typing each interview out myself. And it's a project because I think I told you I'm still working on it. Since we published, I've interviewed 6 more players, and I've identified 1 or 2 more that I want to interview as well. I only interview retired players. And so I'm going to go ahead and at some point publish the 2nd edition, which is going to be called Matzoh Balls and Baseballs, 2nd Inning.
Great. And when should we look for that, Dave?
I don't know. I had a meeting with the publisher about 4 or 5 months ago, and they're ready to go ahead and move forward with it. It's down to me about how quickly I want to do that. And there are 1 or 2 players that I do want to include before I publish the 2nd Inning edition, because to me it would be incomplete without those 2, since they both retired since I published in 2010. But it's it's a fun project. I like the fact that it has an indefinite shelf life. Of the 6 players that I've interviewed since 2010, I've lost a couple of them. They've passed away since since I've talked to them. So, I've always felt like there are a couple of former players like a Hank Greenberg and a Sandy Koufax that your normal baseball fan will recognize. But my idea for this book came about as well as wanting to tell the stories of all of those Jewish former players who you don't know anything about.
Right.
Not you personally, but
Yeah,
baseball
I
fans.
understand. Yeah.
So it's really to tell the stories of those who were not major stars. And in some cases, like Larry Yellen, Larry played over 2 seasons. He only appeared in 14 games. So he was in Cup of Coffee, but he's also in my book. But I went a little deeper into his career than Cup of Coffee did.
Yeah.
But I wanted to be able to tell these guys' stories and bring them to light for those who have an interest in the ethnicity of, Jewish baseball players.
Right. And your book can be found on Amazon, correct?
Oh yeah, it's on Amazon.com. It's on all the outlets, the publisher's website. So there's even multiple copies on eBay.
Oh, great. So we can get a copy pretty easily. Great.
Yeah.
So Dave, to wrap up, what's in your future and what career advice would you give someone just starting out today?
I'll answer the second question first, because I've been saying this for years, and some students listen and some students don't. The whole time I was in school, I was on the 12-year plan. And I'll tell you why. So I got to Georgia State in 82, but I didn't graduate with a bachelor's until 94. Now I was out for 6 years in between when I was working at one of the radio stations, WCNN. But prior to that, I went to school part-time, and I worked in the radio business part-time at night at WGST back when they were at 920 on the dial.
Yeah.
I always tell students, and I tell my own oldest who's at Georgia State right now and trying to graduate, work while you're in school. And if you can work while you're in school, try to work in and around the area that you want to pursue a career in. That way, when you graduate, you won't wake up, say you graduate on Friday, you won't wake up Monday morning and say, well, now what do I do? I don't know anybody. I've not worked in the industry that I want to work in. I'm like, this is what they should have been doing their junior and senior year, getting their feet wet at the shallow end of the pool in that industry, so that when they graduate and it's time to dive in, they've got some working knowledge of the industry that they want to work in. They've made contacts, they've met people, they've networked. And I run across people students who, some heed that advice, not necessarily just for me, but other people as well that are in their ear, and some don't. And it's like, you've invested all of this money and all of your time in this college education. You have to invest almost as much in networking and meeting people in your industry. And I mean, it's a job getting a job.
Yes.
As you know.
Yeah.
So while I think taking the time to study and be in school is important, and book learning is important, it's just as important while you're in school. I always say starting in your junior year, if possible, to begin to identify a part-time job or whatever, and it can be an internship, but exposing yourself to the industry that you want to work in. Because as you know, networking and connections, you can't have enough of them.
That's for sure. You can't buy that.
Right. And for me, I'm at Georgia State now, again, 40 years, going on 23 full-time in the alumni office. And, Georgia State's in an interesting time right now. I got a brand new president who's been here a year now, President Brian Blake. So it's interesting to see each time you bring in new leadership, the university shifts direction a little bit. It can morph in this direction or from that direction. And, Georgia State's the largest university in the state of Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
It's doing a lot of great things, as you know, the
Mm-hmm.
impact that it makes on 52,000 plus students every day, the impact that it has on not just the city of Atlanta, but the state of Georgia. So it's a really interesting time, again, to sit back and watch it, but also be kind of in what I call the eye of the storm. When you and I were in school, there was no on-campus living.
Right.
I step outside my front door in the Alumni Center, and there's between 8,000 and 10,000 students living right at John Wesley Dobbs and Piedmont.
Yeah.
So Georgia State's changing. It's continues to be an exciting time to be in the middle of it, but also to witness its changing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure. Dave, this has been so interesting, and your advice is right on target, and I know the audience will appreciate it. And thank you so much for your time today.
Well, it's been a pleasure being with you, and look forward to speaking with you again.
Absolutely. We've been speaking with Dave Cohen, Radio Hall of Fame recipient, author, alumni program coordinator for Georgia State, and voice of the Panthers. I'm your host, Diane Bogino, helping you build a better career so you can create a better life.